Every November, I get deeply sad. Not a cutesy bad mood fixed by a bit of rest and Netflix sad, but rather a kind of deep, non-emergency but spiritual kind of sadness that I feel is not debilitating enough to be clinical depression, but is something of concern. Let me explain it like this. As the days shorten, something like a winter haze covers my eyelids, filled with a complex brew of nostalgia for the summer and the autumn, yearning for the spring, anxiety for the coming holidays, a paranoia to purchase gifts and coordinate holiday visits and plan my stupid birthday and Christmas, as well a deep sense of loneliness. We might call this seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, defined as a type of depression where the darkness is believed to set off a chemical change in the brain leading to feelings of sadness, lack of energy, loss of interest in usual activities, oversleeping, and weight gain. But get this. In a 2016 study, we looked across the 4 seasons to see if there was an association with sunlight, and we simply didn't find a direct relationship with sunlight, the seasons, or latitude. I'm not saying people don't get depressed in winter. I think the clearest way to understand what we're saying is that I don't believe the lack of sunlight is the important causal mechanism there. What the hell is going on here? I thought we had this thing settled. The light goes off, the darkness makes my brain sad. What do you mean the truth about seasonal affective disorder is more complicated and perhaps doesn't even exist in the first place? That the solutions like light therapy amount to nothing more than folk psychology? What do you mean? What do you mean? Chapter 1. Belle, let's talk. The origins of mental health apparently date back to the 1800s, rooted in this term mental hygiene. After the Civil War, which was apparently very unsanitary, what with all the blood and the death and the revolution, people were concerned about general hygiene and unsanitary conditions, and some guy thought, well, what about our unsanitary mind? How do we build our mental hygiene? And so the word mental hygiene appeared in English literature in 1843 for the first time in a book called Mental Hygiene, or an examination of the intellect and passions designed to illustrate their influence on health and duration of life. A long title that makes you appreciate works like the Holy Bible and Cat in the Hat. In 1893, the term mental hygiene was defined as the art of preserving the mind against all incidents and influences calculated to deteriorate its qualities, impair its energies, or derange its movements. At the end of the 1800s, when everyone was obsessed with Charles Darwin, evolutionary thought influenced the way people thought about mental hygiene. Mental illness was perhaps biological, a mutation, a result of being unsuccessfully adapted to the environment. Decades and decades later, mental hygiene has more thinkers attached to it. Some want to bring in the effects of urbanization and industrialization, some the impact of family and community, sex and gender, the effects of World War I. A book called Mental Hygiene and Public Health was published around the 1949s and continues to shape global health services today. All this to say, it makes sense why modern concepts of mental health have just never sat quite right with me. Mental health to me has always seemed so disconnected with the fundamental aspects of our conscious experience and our deeply felt sense of self and humanity. I mean, when we talk about our mental health, are we not talking about our entire psychological and spiritual makeup and not just keeping our mind hygienic, which is how I think modern institutions sometimes treat the issue? Are we not talking about our very humanity? To be human is to what? To have a rich inner life, an inner universe, one that is complicated and layered but core to who we are and how we perceive the world and ourselves. How we interact with people and engage in day-to-day life. Our conscious experience is all that we own at the end of the day. Our inner universe is our only universe. It is our sight and smell and sense of touch and taste and hearing and perception. It is our fears and stresses and how all of those might weave together with our memories and the processing capability of our brains that allows you to sit here right now understanding these words based on the words and knowledge you've heard before, each experience tainted with the one before it. And our personality is just layered on top of this, coating the very fabric of ourselves, seeming to sit in the core of our skin, perhaps guided by our genetic makeup and pushing us forward like faint GPS signals, and perhaps molded by the memories we don't even remember as children, the way our parents raised us and how they carved the very contours of our being with every look and gesture and lesson for better or for worse. That is what human conscious experience is like. The term mental health just kind of glosses over all of that. And sometimes the word mental health isn't just a shorthand to talk about ourselves more deeply. Today, I feel mental health is the only language we have to talk about the deepest parts of ourselves. What I mean is, if people want to talk about their human experience or their spirituality, their purpose in life, or perhaps the deep existential crisis they feel living in late-stage capitalism, they all have to use the terms defined by the institutions of wellness and mental health. In many ways, those institutions define our modern-day philosophy of being. You know, I've been around the block. I've been through some cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety, and one of the methods taught to me was the tennis ball method. The idea is, you have an anxious thought, what if I fail? And then you throw a tennis ball to the other side. What if I don't fail? And you provide evidence for that side. The result is this strange in-betweenness of anxiety and tranquility. You walk away thinking, well, maybe I won't fail because all of this evidence suggests that I won't. It's this kind of mental painkiller that is helpful on a superficial level, but yet still doesn't really address the core injury. Why am I anxious in the first place? Why is anxiety part of my human experience? Are there political and institutional structures making me anxious? Is it our ethical obligation to remove anxiety and stress on a collective level as much as possible, especially if stress is the leading cause of disease and death for everyone? Whatever, throw the tennis ball. The language we have for mental health might be obscuring rather than building a sense of consciousness of ourselves, our world, and solidarity among our community. For example, I think most of us talk about our jobs in terms of anxiety, stress, the Sunday scaries, and burnout. Burnout is especially recent, or at least recently popular. The feeling and the word dominated the 2020s, the pandemic's hybrid work era, where we were all beginning to name burnout as a unique flavor of overwhelming, debilitating stress. Psychological theories of burnout say that it is different from stress in that it has a sense of hopelessness attached to it. This idea that all the minor and major stresses of work and school just seem to pile up, and all the bureaucratic barriers that keep you from doing the work the best or advancing in your career, and all the toxic fumes of toxic workplace culture just seem to paralyze you. You feel there is no end in sight. During the pandemic, the loneliness and isolation added to all this, and so the word burnout came to define that period in time. I remember when we called during the pandemic certain groups of people essential workers, and there were cheers in the street every time these nurses and teachers and grocery store workers and fast food workers and cashier and garbage people would be walking to their jobs. We called these essential workers heroes. And then, what felt like months later, when they were all burnt out and asking for better working conditions and higher pay, the world turned on them again with the same old stories. They said teachers and nurses already made too much money and they're being ungrateful. Minimum wage jobs are unskilled jobs, and fast food workers are just kids anyway. They don't need more money. They should find a new job if they're not being paid enough and they're so unhappy about it. In this way, despite burnout defining the 2020s, the word didn't lead to any collective political solidarity with the people who are affected. It still doesn't, despite stats that say almost everyone is burnt out right now. I think it's because the word burnout implies that there is something wrong with an individual person. It is a mental health therapy term that suggests an individual's unique case of stress, and if only they go through enough counseling or perfect their stress strategies and their emotional coping techniques or find another job, they might get rid of their burnout. What if the word that came to define the pandemic was alienation instead? Alienation is this old Marxist term that names a fundamental disconnection with our work. We are so disconnected from our work because we are often creating products and pouring our creativity, our time, and energy into a job where we ultimately own nothing at the end of the day. We have such little control over what happens on a large scale, and though we often see there are better ways of doing things on the ground level at our jobs, we have no power or decisions over the constant changes happening at our workplace. We see fellow workers as competitors rather than potential allies that could help us change the situation or at least negotiate for better conditions. We see problematic, struggling people at our jobs and sometimes wish they were just fired. We see middle managers as our enemies, and sometimes middle managers have to be our enemies because their own jobs are on the line too. And so in many ways we are alienated from ourselves and our work and our community. Alienation leads to burnout, of course, but for me, I like the word better to define this moment in time. It's an uncommon word, and yet it is incredibly obvious that we all feel this way, and I think those in power probably don't want us to learn the word. Essential workers during the pandemic certainly felt alienated and disconnected. They do all this work to keep society functioning, they put their lives on the line, and yet executives above them were the ones that got the pay raise. When they asked for better pay and better working conditions, fellow workers turned on them, wondering that if fast food workers got increased pay, then why didn't they? The mental health term burnout closes this conversation and discussion. It points to the individual suffering of one person, where the natural next step is to ask, how can we help this person? How can we fix their psychology? But the word alienation points to a collective problem, and the natural next step is to ask, well, alienation from what? Why are we so alienated? The word builds this sense of political consciousness and paves the way to solidarity. In other words, mental health language is cold, clinical, and clean, perhaps too clean. And the cleanliness has some deep consequences, and as we saw, political consequences. As I mentioned, the definition of mental health is historically constructed, coming out of a context of war and mental hygiene and protecting against harm and unsanitary practices, rather than any philosophy that alludes to a deeper human experience. One of my frustrations is this: what if modern medicine or the concept of our physical body was historically rooted in physical hygiene? I have cancer, you might say, and the doctor would be like, well, have you taken a shower recently? Have you used extra toothpaste? In a similar way, if we say, I am deeply sad, especially during the winter where I feel nostalgia for the summer and a deep sense of loneliness constructed by modern capitalism, the psychologist might say, well, have you tried buying an artificial light? Have you tried using this cognitive behavioral technique to reframe the struggle into something positive? Have you used the tennis ball technique? In other words, what begins as a concern about my loneliness, my lack of community, my existential crisis related to capitalism and my purpose in life ends with a fairly shallow solution. And perhaps these shallow solutions that, by the way, I have to purchase, replace some deeper engagement with more meaningful, more long-term political actions. A fairly famous New Yorker essay has discussed a related phenomenon, the rise of therapy speak. It's as though the haze of our inner lives were being filtered through a screen of therapy worksheets. We just want to name a dynamic. We joke about our coping mechanisms, codependent relationships, and avoidant attachment styles. We practice self-care and shun toxic acquaintances. We project and decathect. We are triggered, we say wryly, adding that we dislike the word. We catastrophize, ruminate, press on the wound, process. We feel seen and we feel heard, or we feel unseen and we feel unheard, or we feel heard but not listened to, not actively. Are these therapy terms really helping us? Helping us to name and clarify the very nuanced and niche parts of the human experience? In an ideal world, maybe that's what therapy would be for. We would be walking around with more specific language about our inner conscious experience, and with that language, we would be able to relate to each other more. We would be less lonely, able to name our problems more accurately and connect with each other, be more willing to help each other. But it seems to me that therapy terms are doing something else, something more sinister and perhaps even more classist. That they are terms people use to perform emotional intelligence and show that they are indeed a smart person, an emotionally aware person, an ethical person, someone who knows the right therapy terms, someone who is doing the right thing by going into therapy. Therapy. In order to live as a grown-up, a modern and responsible adult, someone who has their life together, that involves today going to therapy. Never mind that most people can't afford it, that therapy seems to be only accessible to a certain level of income and a certain demographic, that it is a privatized kind of healthcare, one that individualizes solution to some pretty collective, pretty political problems. Never mind that a large amount of our emotional problems and stresses stem from work and capitalism, money and the economy, putting our bodies through a constant 9 to 5, 5 to 9, overtime experience, and that perhaps resources into therapy might be better spent politically organizing, advocating for a massive societal shift somehow. Never mind that a lot of therapists out there are trash, or at least my last therapist was, who kept talking over me instead of listening to me, which seems to me one of the most fundamental errors you can make at a job like that. And perhaps some therapists out there like the power, like to reaffirm our biases, reaffirming that we are the hero of our own stories and no one else deserves the time, no one else deserves to be validated, assuring us that nothing is ever our fault and we are all just misunderstood underdogs with complicated backstories. Never mind, never mind. Okay, sorry to drag therapy. Obviously, it's very important to people and has done a lot of good in the world, and it has helped me a lot too. I am, however, pointing out a societal shift. Perhaps we are now over-relying on the institution of Western psychology as the be-all, end-all of our problems. Perhaps my real qualm with therapy is this idea that someone who is not going to therapy is not worthy of the same care or attention from their community. I feel like this is a sort of new phenomenon, or at least a phenomenon I'm noticing more as an adult. It seems like people, if they are doing something strange or out of character, if they seem like they need help because they are dealing with a messy relationship or some kind of bad experience, they are told to just go to therapy. I think this impulse to tell people to go to therapy comes from a correct instinct to not have mental health be so stigmatized. This instinct was perhaps trained in us by the hashtag #BellLet'sTalk, a Canadian mental health campaign that was ubiquitous growing up. People would use the hashtag #BellLet'sTalk and be promised that every time they posted they would get X amount of dollars given to mental health organizations. The campaign's goal was to encourage people to talk about their mental health in an effort to normalize discussions around seeking mental health help. Whereas generations prior shamed people for not going to therapy, they called people crazy and put people in insane asylums. Today we are much more progressive, right? We are more willing to talk about therapy, going to therapy, recommending therapy. We are more willing to share our stories alongside corporate brands in order to destigmatize and normalize. I need not remind you that a corporation's goal is primarily profit, that it's suspicious that talks around mental health have to be branded in a campaign that amounted to 1.3 billion impressions and essentially millions of dollars worth of free advertising. The goal of Bell Let's Talk was to normalize mental health, but normalize and destigmatize aren't political projects worthy in and of themselves. Corporate America likes to think so. Let's normalize mental health. Let's normalize talking about Alzheimer's. Let's normalize gay people. But normalizing is a safe word, literally meaning to make normal. It can be branded and easily converted into advertising worth millions of dollars. Along the way, brands like Bell use normalize to purchase goodwill that allows them to disguise their use of prison labor behind the scenes. To normalize something should be one step as part of a larger liberation political project. Let's not just normalize mental health, let's address the root causes of human suffering. Let's not just normalize gay people, let's have queer liberation. Anyways, perhaps our efforts to normalize mental health have led to an overcorrection that prioritized therapy above humanity. We are saying there is no shame to go to therapy, so you should go. You should go for all your problems, you see. I'm going to therapy and you should go too. It's become no longer our responsibility to help our friends or a community going through rough times. That's the therapist's job. In fact, we sometimes feel we don't have the capacity to hear our friends' problems. We don't have the training to listen to them. We aren't willing to listen to them. In fact, we are annoyed by their problems and wish they would just go to therapy. The emotional caretaking that used to come so easy to us is no longer our area of expertise, and so we push people aside. Obviously, I'm not saying that we should dump our traumas on our friends and our family all the time and that we should start acting more like therapists. And obviously, there are some specific and terrible experiences like violent trauma that are well suited for a clinical setting. But I am pointing out that sometimes complex, everyday human problems are worth our attention, and sometimes they can be addressed by us regular people. Perhaps psychological problems, deep conversation should not be exclusively in the realm of the therapist, and perhaps we are doing a disservice to our loved ones if we continually doubt our abilities to listen as a friend and refuse to hear their concerns on the grounds of "I am not your therapist." Perhaps Western psychology itself as a field of study doesn't have the patent for human suffering, and that it is worth looking to other forms of knowledge making when thinking about our own selves and our own humanity. And perhaps even terrible experiences like trauma should not be confined to a clinical setting. This is counterintuitive as we are sensitive to not trigger people and re-traumatize people by voicing what has happened to us. This might be an effective emotional strategy within the moment, but at scale, perhaps it is not a good political one. In the book Towards Psychologies of Liberation, it's taken seriously this idea that individual trauma should be shared in collective spaces. That in fact, violence, especially colonial violence, has a project to force a kind of historical amnesia. People in power, whether abusive partners or colonizers or capitalists, want you to forget the pain they've inflicted on you. They want our experiences to be confined only in the clinic so that there is no historical record of what horrible things they have done. Maybe it should be the project of psychology to combine many disciplines together in an effort to name and record the violence done to us. Perhaps there is a time and place to share trauma. Not long ago, homosexuality was considered a sociopathic personality disturbance in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, which, as a sociopathic homosexual, kind of eats. But maybe that says something about how psychological knowledge is formed. What will be considered offensive 10 to 20 years from now? What today is considered within the domain of academic psychology that turns out to be normal, everyday human experience? What goals of psychology will be considered outdated 10 to 20 years from now? I think most psychologists and therapists have this assumption. Their job is to help people adapt to the demands of the modern world, becoming happier and successful individuals with various psychological coping techniques. While this goal might seem innocent and common sense, is it really serving anyone but ourselves? Decades and decades of modern therapy, the rise of therapy speak, CEOs going to therapy, the professional class taking mental health leaves while lower working class people live paycheck to paycheck. Are we all just becoming pretentious, emotionally intelligent assholes? It's hard to say. It's hard to imagine if psychological services would still exist after the revolution is over and all poverty is abolished. I imagine that some version would be there in some more integrated way, because maybe there is some fundamental fucked upness of being human that needs to be tended to by a listening ear. But maybe in this alternate universe where there is no poverty, maybe psychology's goals would be different. Maybe it would have learned that true psychological restoration starts with a kind of collective hope building, a community solidarity. Maybe psychology in an alternate universe has learned individual healing must begin with collective healing. New update just dropped, by the way. Seasonal affective disorder is no longer classified as a standalone subtype diagnosis. It's now an add-on to major depressive disorder, a DLC you purchase in the winter. It's now major depressive order with recurring seasonal pattern that occurs at a specific time of year but remits otherwise. Seasonal affective disorder had sketchy beginnings. Some guy in the 1980s diagnosed himself with it when he moved from South Africa to New York City, talked to some reporters about it who got excited and who published it ahead of time. A newspaper article was the one who actually popularized the disorder. Me, I never liked seasonal affective disorder, never identified with it, always thought it was inadequate to discuss what was happening during the darker months, the rampant capitalism of the holidays and the return to more intense working days in September, the weather cutting you off from nature and your community, the lack of social traditions during November, then the overstimulation of the December holidays, the daylight savings messing up your entire brain chemistry. Seasonal affective disorder was always so ineffective for explaining the world to me. At last, I've seen the light.